So we'll continue with Darwin's evidence for species change. Exhibit A was the fossil record. Exhibit B is what we will call the geographic distribution of species. Now, what does that mean? Well, here's a map of the world. When you look around, you find that species are located in certain places around the world. Darwin argued that the locations of species was a clue to species origin. For instance, at the time, Darwin was considering different hypotheses for why certain species were in the locations they were, and one idea was what we'll call the climate hypothesis, that wherever there were cold climates, for example, then maybe God had placed certain species that are well adapted to cold climates in those locations. If so, then you would expect that particular species would be found wherever you would find those cold climates. And we can use our if-and-then reasoning to test this type of hypothesis. If God placed species on Earth according to their adaptations for climate conditions only, and we check for the existence of penguins and polar bears in the North and the South Pole, then here's what we should find. Polar bears and penguins should be found in the North and the South Pole, right? So in other words, the penguins and polar bears have adaptations for cold climates, so our prediction would be that both polar bears and penguins should be found in both regions, because both regions have cold climates. Well, where are penguins and polar bears located? Turns out that the polar bears are only found in the north and penguins in the southern hemisphere, right? Now that seems to weaken the climate hypothesis, that God just sort of placed species who were well adapted to cold climates, placed them in all of the cold climates, right? So on the climate hypothesis, God has equipped both polar bears and penguins with adaptations to survive in cold climates, and so we might expect to find both of them wherever we find those cold climates, but we don't. We find polar bears up in the north and penguins in the south. Now, of course, again, we've seen the weakness of trying to get inside God's mind. It could be that God had reasons for separating the polar bears and the penguins, right? But for Darwin, these are religious ideas, and they can't be tested. Darwin's going to look for a natural explanation for why the polar bears and the penguins are in their locations. And it would go something like this. Darwin would argue that the polar bears up here in the northern hemisphere exist in the north here because that was the origin site for that species. So we might have had some ancestral bears migrating up into the north and evolving into polar bears. Now, why are they not found in the southern hemisphere? Because that would require that the polar bears migrate down through climates that are not suitable for them, right? So desert conditions and so on. And that's a huge migration. That would be an obstacle to the spread of that species to the southern colder climates. So for Darwin, the reason why polar bears are in the north and not the south is because the species originated in the north and then could not migrate to the southern cold climates. Likewise for penguins, the idea would be that the penguins evolved in the south and haven't yet migrated to the northern colder climates. In fact, there are actually equatorial species of penguins, the Galapagos penguins actually. So who knows, in time, maybe some of those penguins will venture up into the northern hemisphere. But right now, the polar bears and penguins are separated. So for Darwin, the climate hypothesis is weakened, because after all, we should expect both polar bears and penguins in the north and the south cold climates. And his idea that the reason why we see these two species where they are has to do with the origin of those species. Polar bears originating in the north and then can't migrate to the south. Penguins originating in the south and haven't yet migrated up north.